The wind off the harbor carried the smell of oil and sea metal through the half-open bay doors. A Founders Week banner rattled on its ropes, the words half-faded but still proud. Safety makes legacy. Inside the workshop bay, 4 engineers stood around a locked steel cabinet. The youngest, Eli, juggled a set of keys with the reckless confidence of someone who hadn't been burned yet. "This, the one he asked?" "That's the one," Frank Delaney said, his voice low and steady. "Keep your hand flat when you open it." The lock clicked. Hinges creaked loud enough to echo through the empty hangar. Inside sat 3 dull canisters labeled in red stencil, "Explosive fuel test, use only." The air shifted metallic and dry. Frank leaned in, reading the serial numbers. "Same batch that failed 2 years ago," he murmured, "back before the new mix. And now we're testing it again." Eli's voice cracked slightly. "We're not testing the fuel," Frank replied. "We're testing our control." He looked to the others, Clara from compliance and Miguel, the quiet machinist, who spoke mostly with gestures. They all knew the story last time a rival team had lost pressure control and nearly taken half the line with them. This was their chance to prove that discipline could be safer than speed. Clara unfolded the checklist, running a finger down the first column. Containment procedure, confirmed temperature stability, ignition barrier functional. "All functional," Miguel said, tapping the control box. Frank straightened the chill from the concrete floor creeping up his spine. "This," he said, "is the day we turn it into the secret that prevents explosions." For a moment, no one breathed. The hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound. Then a voice cut through the stillness, sharp, officious. "What do you think you're doing with that fuel?" The town board's safety officer, Mrs. Kemp, had appeared in the doorway, clipboard and handcoat flapping like a flag of authority. Behind her, 2 volunteers with cameras hovered nervously. "You're storing explosive fuel in a public facility," she demanded. "It's sealed," Clara said quickly. "Controlled, monitored, non-reactive until—" "Until what?" Kemp interrupted. "Until it blows." Frank held his ground. "It's part of the safety demonstration," he said, "to show the difference between volatile and stable handling. And you thought the middle of Founders Week was the time for that," she shot back. "It's exactly the time," he said, "because the town remembers the explosion and it deserves to see the cure." The cameras caught the glint of the canister's label, "Explosive fuel." The words looked guilty, even in perfect containment. Kemp scribbled something on her pad. "You'll hear from the board," she said coldly. "Until then, seal that cabinet. No tests, no demonstrations, nothing leaves this room." She turned on her heel and left her heels cracking across the concrete like a countdown. No one spoke. The banner outside snapped again in the wind. Frank reached out and pressed a thumb over the printed word "explosive," smudging the dust until the red faded under his touch. He didn't say a word, just traced the edge of the warning label the way a man might read a name on a gravestone. The others watched, unsure if it was shame or patience that held him still. He turned the key, locking the cabinet once more. The sound was final, like the closing of a long argument. He closed the lid and waited for the truth to ignite. The drafting table was a battlefield of blue ink and coffee rings. Rolls of blueprints leaned like tired soldiers against the wall, their edges curled from years of edits and repairs. The hum of the overhead lights was steady, like the sound of a machine that had long forgotten how to rest. Eli balanced his coffee cup on the corner of the table, ignoring the ring it left on the safety schematic. "You ever think," he said, "that maybe we hide behind all these rules because we're afraid to fail?" Frank didn't look up. He was checking pressure ratios in the checklist notebook, tracing each figure with a pencil until the tip dulled. "Rules aren't fear," he said. "No." Eli grinned. "Then what are they, boundaries that let you walk back home?" Miguel chuckled from the bench by the window. He was filing a metal fitting until it sang a high note. Clara Reed sat on a stool typing the day's test report into a humming desktop terminal. "Regulations have faces now," she said dryly. "The board's coming again on Thursday." "They always come on Thursday," Frank replied. "Gives them the weekend to write up disappointment." The men laughed, but it wasn't humor, it was relief with nowhere to go. Steam from the coffee curled through the lamplight, carrying the bitter smell of long nights. On the blueprint, the combustion chamber looked perfect until you noticed the faint erased lines beneath it, ghosts of earlier attempts. Eli tapped the paper. "You know what's wrong with this." Go ahead, Frank said. It's too careful. He spread the blueprint flat with both hands. Everything about this project, the checklist, the calculations, it's all about not being the one who breaks something. Where's the invention in that? Right there, Frank said quietly, in the part that doesn't break. Eli frowned. Safety isn't bravery, it's bureaucracy. No, Frank answered without raising his voice. It's memory in numbers. The line hung between them heavier than the sound of the lights. Clara stopped typing. Miguel set the file down. For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking over the blueprint marking seconds that no one wanted to claim. Frank finally exhaled. You think I write these numbers because I love paperwork? I write them so that the next man doesn't have to guess which number kills him. Eli looked down, tracing the smudged line where the ink had bled into the paper. Maybe, he said, but sometimes it feels like we're building fences instead of engines. Then make sure the gate opens, Frank replied. Outside, rain whispered against the tin roof. The shop light flickered once, casting long shadows across the drafting table. Miguel rose, stretched, and said nothing. He simply reached for another fitting and started polishing again, rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. The coffee had gone cold. Frank capped his pen, flipped the checklist notebook closed, and looked at the younger man. You want to test tomorrow? Yeah, Eli said, uncertain now. If the board lets us. They don't decide that, Frank replied. We do by what we prove. The older man turned off the lamp, leaving only the dull glow of the clock face on the far wall. The gauge wasn't the only thing under pressure. The rain came down steady, turning the workshop roof into a drum. Inside, the welding hum from Miguel's corner filled the air with a low electric growl. Sparks arced briefly, flashing across the unfinished test rig that stood in the center of the bay, a glass-walled chamber the size of a washing machine rigged with copper tubing and brass valves. Clara Reed stepped inside, clipboard tucked under her arm. Her boots left wet marks on the concrete. She didn't bother with greetings. Where's the safety line? Here, Frank said, tapping the ground tape, 3 feet from the panel. And the town inspector canceled, he replied. Budget cuts. We're our own witnesses today. She frowned. That's not a good sentence to hear in a fuel lab. It's not a good time to be careful either, he said. Eli looked up from the console. His hands were steady, but his jaw wasn't. The checklist notebook lay open beside him, half the lines already signed off in Frank's tight handwriting. You really think this will work? Eli asked. It has to, Frank said. If it doesn't, they'll close the program by spring. The rain hit harder, masking the hiss of compressed air from the rig. Clara walked the perimeter, checking the bolts with a gloved hand, the faint scratch of her clipboard pencil chasing the sound of the storm. All right, she said finally. System integrity pass. Containment window clear. Visibility good. Pressure at 00. Frank glanced at Miguel, who nodded once and wiped sweat from his forehead with a rag blackened by weeks of work. The room went quiet, except for the rain. Load the fuel, Frank said. Eli reached for the sealed silver canister, its red label catching the fluorescent light. The metal was cold against his palms. He lowered it carefully into the harness, aligning the threads with the intake valve. The explosive fuel canister clicks into the test cradle. A sound small enough to miss, but heavy enough to change everything. Clara wrote the time on her clipboard, 14:27, and looked up. Fuel locked. Pressure seal confirmed. Power to the pumps, Frank ordered. Miguel flipped the breaker. The lights dimmed as the system hummed to life. Needles trembled on the dials. Numbers blinked green on the monitor. Frank's hand hovered above the ignition switch, not to trigger an explosion, but to start the pressure feed, the first breath of their long theory made real. No one spoke. The rain, the welding hum, the soft tick of relays, all of it seemed to hold its breath with them. His fingers hovered above the switch and the whole room waited. He pressed it. The compressor whined. The gauge flicked once, twice, then began its climb through the colored bands, green, yellow, amber. Eli leaned closer, counting under his breath. 10 psi, 15, still stable. Keep it steady, Frank murmured. No rush. A bead of condensation rolled down the glass of the chamber. The line on the monitor curved, stuttered, then the needle began to move. The hydraulic hiss filled the bay as the pumps woke. Pressure built in the lines, deep and rhythmic, like the slow heartbeat of the machine itself. Metal groaned under strain. The glass chamber shuddered slightly, holding its breath just as the engineers did. Frank Delaney's voice came low and deliberate. "Feed line open. Begin flow." Miguel adjusted the valve. A pale stream of explosive fuel began to thread through the copper coils, glinting under the shop lights like liquid amber. The gauge needles twitched, searching for balance. Pressure steady at 22, Clara called from the console. Temperature holding. Frank leaned in his reflection, wavering on the glass of the chamber. The faint smell of burnt metal mixed with the rain-washed air seeping through the roof vents. "This is it," Eli whispered. "Moment of truth." "Truth's overrated," Frank replied. "We're after proof." The hiss deepened to a steady hum. The fuel pulsed through the rig alive, dangerous, beautiful. Every number on the screen represented a possible disaster, but it also marked control pressure density, ignition delay, containment ratio. The checklist notebook lay open beside Clara's elbow. Each line was a small act of faith: valve secure, seal verified, reaction inhibited. "Last test in the old world," Miguel muttered. "First one in the new," Frank said. He watched the display climb toward the red band, the zone where, by all logic, the fuel should have flared into violence. The team said nothing. Only the hydraulics spoke, and the faint tapping of Clara's pen as she logged readings. The numbers froze at peak. A single drop of fuel inside the chamber split into vapor, shimmered, and instead of igniting, condensed harmlessly against the wall. The reaction ended itself. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Eli blinked, uncertain. "Did it?" It held. Clara interrupted. Her voice was small, as if afraid the sound would break the spell. The gauge steadied. Temperature flatlined. No fire, no burst, no explosion. Just the soft quiet that came after impossible things behaved. Frank took a slow breath. "That's the number," he said. "That's the discipline." He stepped forward, wrote the result on the pad, and initialed it. Clara tore off the final page of the checklist, the last unchecked box now filled in, and passed it to him. Frank pressed the rubber stamp down hard. The ink bled slightly on the paper, leaving the words bold and certain. Validated. Safe reaction. He pinned it on the corkboard beside the door beneath a hand-lettered sign Miguel had made weeks ago. The secret that prevents explosions. The air seemed lighter now. The sound of the pumps faded into a distant murmur. Clara set the pen down. Miguel wiped his hands on a rag, and Eli just stared at the quiet chamber, his disbelief turning slowly into pride. Frank exhaled, his hand resting on the clipboard as if anchoring himself to reality. He smiled, not broadly, but the way a man does when the math has finally matched the prayer. The flame that should have consumed them never appeared. The folding chairs squeaked on the hangar floor as the crowd settled. The radio static from the old loudspeaker fluttered through the rafters, chasing the echo of the rain that had passed an hour ago. The air smelled faintly of oil coffee and the paper programs the town clerk had printed that morning. At the front stood the same wooden board that once held inspection notices and reprimands. Today, a new page was pinned in the center, the secret that prevents explosions. Beneath it, the old fuel canister lid rested on a velvet square freshly engraved with the date and 4 names. Mayor Givens adjusted the microphone. It squealed once, then steadied. "When this began," he said, "we called it recklessness. We said it couldn't be done, that you don't turn fire into safety. But these engineers proved us wrong." A murmur rippled through the rows of townspeople, machinists, families, even a few students from the trade school. Frank stood at the back beside Clara, hands clasped loosely. Miguel leaned against the doorframe, his sleeves rolled up. Eli shifted his weight, the sound of his boots loud in the hush. "The board," the mayor continued, "has voted unanimously to reinstate the lab's funding and to recognize the work done here as a matter of public record." He held up a sheet of paper, the checklist Clara had written its corner still faintly smudged with ink. "We'll read it once the mayor said so it's not forgotten." The loudspeaker crackled, then carried his voice across the hangar valve secure. Seal verified, reaction inhibited, pressure sustained, containment absolute. Each line, once routine, now sounded like scripture. People nodded quietly. A woman in the second row dabbed her eyes. Clara looked at Frank. "They're quoting us," she whispered. "Let them," he said softly. "It's about time the math got applause." The The crowd murmured approval. Someone turned the radio volume up so that towns outside could hear. The broadcast cut briefly to the local announcer. "You're listening to Founders Week coverage. Today, the engineers at Bayline Workshop received commendation for developing what they call the secret that prevents explosions, a new safety standard for high-energy fuels." His voice faded into the warm static of the band, replaced by a burst of clapping from the hangar. The mayor stepped down, shook Frank's hand, and nodded toward the board. "Would you like to say something?" "No," Frank said. "We already did. It's right there." He pointed to the checklist pinned under glass. The crowd laughed softly. The applause rose again, spreading like a tide through the folding chairs, bouncing off the metal walls until it became one long sound of forgiveness. And then slowly it ebbed. The mayor lowered the microphone. The radio hum thinned. The wind through the open hangar door lifted the corner of the velvet cloth. Clara gathered her notes. Eli looked up at the faint sunlight cutting across the floor. For the first time in months, the air smelled like calm metal and dry rain, the scent of work finished honestly. The sound of thanks was almost silence. The museum air was cool and faintly metallic, touched with the scent of polish and old wiring. Beyond the glass partitions, the brass gleam of a new display caught the morning light. Visitors slowed their steps as they entered the corner exhibit labeled Local Innovations, Founders Week Retrospective. A small guitar strum drifted from a nearby speaker, the soft theme of the town's radio program. The announcer's voice, warm and steady, filled the quiet. "Today, we remember the Bayline engineers," he said, "the men and women who once turned fear into patience and precision into peace." Beneath the broadcast microphone, the plaque hung on the wall. It was simple rectangular, polished to a mirror sheen. The engraving read, "How Engineers Turned Explosive Fuel into the Secret That Prevented Explosions, presented to Frank Delaney and Team Founders Week, 1998. The words caught the light, every letter holding a trace of the flame that never came. A family stood in front of it, a father, a daughter, a young boy with a baseball cap turned backward. The boy pressed his nose close to the glass. "Dad," he whispered, "was it really dangerous?" "Back then? Yes," the father said. "They worked with fuel that could burn through steel, but they figured out how to stop it, not by fear, by control." The boy's eyes followed the reflection of his own face on the brass. "Did they get rich?" "No," his father smiled. "They got respected. That's rarer." The radio voice faded for a moment, replaced by a faint hum. Then another clip played, a familiar one, Clara Reed's voice from an old interview. "We weren't trying to make history," she said. "We were just trying to make sure no one else had to flinch when they lit the switch." Miguel's laughter followed, thin and distant, through the recording. That was Frank's rule. No heroics, just math. Near the corner of the exhibit, the original checklist rested under glass. The ink had browned slightly, but every line was legible. Valve secure. Seal verified. Reaction inhibited. Containment absolute. Next to it, a photograph showed the team, 4 figures in work coats, standing by the test rig. Frank's hand rested on the fuel canister lid, now polished and engraved with their names. Clara's eyes were on the camera. Frank's were not. He seemed to be looking somewhere beyond it, like he still heard the hum of pressure in the pipes. A visitor approached the curator, an elderly woman in a blue scarf who had helped set up the display. "Did they ever patent it?" "No," the curator said softly. "They gave it to the Standards Bureau. It's still in use. Every fuel transport, every refinery test, their formula keeps the fire where it belongs." Sunlight broke through the museum window, falling across the plaque. The reflection danced across the engraved letters, spilling faint gold light onto the floor. The boy reached toward it, but stopped just before the rope barrier. The curator smiled. "Go ahead," she said. "Touch it gently." He pressed one finger to the cool metal. "Feels warm," he murmured. "That's memory," his father replied. Outside, the radio broadcast continued. From the workshop, where danger was once routine, came a promise that discipline could save, that patience could burn brighter than fire. The guitar faded into static, and the museum grew quiet again. Frank Delaney's name shone faintly under the glass. His handwriting on the checklist still carried a trace of graphite smudge, as if the story wasn't quite finished. The light trembled once more, bright and weightless, across the final line of the display. He turned danger into memory and memory into mercy.